This time suck. In this video we are looking at religious developments through the reign of Elizabeth I. So this includes Puritans, the Catholics, and then the Separatist movements. So for Elizabeth, the religious church settlement of 1559 seemed to be a major success. This was because it was a compromise between extremist views and it managed to satisfy the vast majority of the country. However, there was still opposition to the settlement, so some people wanted to purify the Church of England of all Catholic elements of both worship and doctrine. Others wanted the restoration of the Pope, along with the ceremonies and beliefs associated with it. So Puritans were a group of English Protestants who believed that the Reformation under Elizabeth I was incomplete. Puritanism dated back to the 1520s, when the educated elite were influenced by the writings of Luther and other continental reformers, and the further influence of John Calvin, who had developed more extreme ideas than Luther, was another influence towards the English population. This meant that they desired the eradication of popish superstition. There was no real organisation within the Puritan group though, however all shared the view that the religious settlement of 1559 was not complete. Instead of a main group, there were three main brands. So there was the moderate Puritan, who reluctantly accepted the structure of the church, but pressed for reform like that in Europe. There was the Presbyterian strand, and they called for a thorough reform of the church, and then the Separatist strand, so they wanted to break away from the national church to pursue their own radical Protestant Reformation. So these tensions led to the vestiarian controversy in 1566, and the emergence of tensions between the Queen, who wanted complete acceptance of her religious settlement, and the Puritans, who wanted to eradicate popish superstitions, led to the vestiarian controversy in 1566. And in 1565, Elizabeth wrote to Archbishop Parker, reminding him of the need to ensure that all clergy were following the religious practices set out in the 1559 injunctions. So this meant that Parker introduced his book of advertisements, which set out what was expected. For example, people were to receive the communion whilst kneeling instead of standing, and he insisted on the surplice and cope as the standard apparel. Now, this was very similar to traditional Catholic clothes. Parker was initially fairly reluctant to introduce these methods though, because the Bible did not prescribe particular clothes. This meant that watered down the requirements in his book of advertisements. But the requirements still caused much outrage, and the discontent was shown by their exclamation of "We shall be killed in our souls for this pollution." Eventually 61 agreed to don the vestments, whilst the other 39 were suspended from their duties and given 3 months to conform. So the vestiarian controversy showed that Elizabeth was determined to enforce the settlement and the conflicting views in the minds of the reforming bishops. So there was the need to obey the royal supremacy and the desire to remove the remaining Catholic elements in the church. So after the vestiarian controversy, Elizabeth continued her strict stance towards the stronger Protestants. So firstly, no license was given to perform divine services to anyone who refused to sign a declaration of conformity. So this meant that many preachers retired into private life as lawyers or doctors, whereas others migrated to the more welcoming air of Scotland or overseas once more to Zurich or Geneva. The Star Chamber also forbid, with the threat of 3 months' imprisonment, the publication of any treatise against the Queen's injunctions. So this meant that either out of fear or indifference, the strong Protestants started to conform. But there was also the Presbyterian movement at this time, and Presbyterians believed in the introduction of a Calvinist form of a church government. So this stated that the office of a bishop should be abolished, all ministers should be equal in status, and lay elders should have a key administrative role. Presbyterians believed that whilst the church was already Calvinist in its doctrine, it needed to be reformed in its structure and its form of worship. This idea was advocated by the Professor of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, Thomas Cartwright. And in 1570, his lectures argued that bishops should be abolished and that the church government should be based on that developed by John Calvin in Geneva. Cartwright argued that this model could be adapted to fit the parish system in England, and it could also be given national cohesion through Calvin's ideas of having regional committees and a national assembly of the whole church. So this Presbyterian movement was seen as closer to the organisation justified in the Bible. This was reinforced in 1572 when John Field and Thomas Wilcox published an admonition to Parliament. So this declared that we in England are so far off being rightly reformed according to the prescript of God's word, and that the Book of Common Prayer was an unperfect book, culled and picked out of the popish dunghill, the mass book of abominations. This also argued that there should be no bishops and that the Presbyterian structure of the church was the only one sanctioned by the Bible. So both Field and Wilcox were imprisoned a year, but their words did coincide with the growth of a Presbyterian movement. Elizabeth did not want Presbyterianism though because of its impact in Scotland, and this was because the Scottish Presbyterian movement had coincided with the deposal of Mary Queen of Scots in the 1560s. So this meant that in 1576, Elizabeth gave explicit instructions to Parliament that they were not to discuss religious matters without her permission. So this meant that proposals to replace the Book of Common Prayer with a new prayer book containing no popish elements was rejected in 1584, and this was advocated by Peter Turner, and then in 1587, and that was advocated by Anthony Cope. Elizabeth also imprisoned Peter Wentworth when he challenged her in 1576, and Wentworth demanded freedom of speech in Parliament on matters of religion, and he said that it was intolerable that religious debate was curtailed because the Queen didn't like it. Presbyterianism also gained support from others in politics, so the Earl of Leicester, the Earl of Huntingdon, and Lord Burleigh all saw Presbyterianism as a positive movement against the influences of Catholicism. This meant that they defended clergymen who were punished due to their Presbyterianism sympathies. So now we need to look at Archbishop Grindal and the prophesyings, as prophesyings were well-organised gatherings of clergymen where young or unlicensed preachers could practice their art and receive advice from the more experienced colleagues, and they also discussed passages of the scripture. Ultimately, these were enjoyed by those of an evangelical persuasion, and that worried the Queen. So in 1576, news reached Elizabeth of some unorthodox preaching at a prophesying in Southam. She had also been told that some of the priests who had been suspended for their radical views had participated. So this meant that she ordered Archbishop Grindal to bring them to an end and to restrict the number of preachers in each shire to 3 or 4. So Grindal consulted other bishops and came to the conclusion that the prophesyings were not dangerous. So this meant that he refused to accept the Queen's instructions. Instead, he sent a letter to the Queen saying that I cannot with a safe conscience give my consent to the suppressing of the said exercise, and he also reminded the Queen that she was a mortal creature. So Elizabeth was furious at this denial of her supremacy, and she placed Grindal under virtual house arrest at Lambeth Palace. She also issued direct orders to her bishops which banned the prophesyings. So in 1583, John Whitgift was appointed the Archbishop of Canterbury after the death of Grindal, and unlike his predecessor Grindal, he set his face against Puritanism. So this was shown when he spoke about the Puritans with great hostility in his inauguration speech. Whitgift was also favoured by Elizabeth because they shared many similar views about religion. Elizabeth even called him her little black husband. But Whitgift immediately issued 3 articles which contained the acknowledgement of the royal supremacy, acceptance of a prayer book as containing nothing contrary to the word of God, and the acceptance of the 39 articles. As a result of his articles, 300 ministers were suspended or forced to resign. Whitgift relied upon the High Commission in order to pursue this heresy, but even so, pressure from councillors like Walsingham and Leicester meant that Whitgift reduced the second article to a simple acceptance of a prayer book, so this meant that more clergy were able to accept it. Now we need to look at the Separatist movements. Separatism was the most extreme form of Puritanism, and they wanted to break from the Church of England so that they could explore the Bible and reach their own conclusions about the direction of their faith. So whilst the majority of Puritans remained in the Anglican Church so they could bring about reform there, some were convinced that reform could not be brought, and they were the ones that separated from the Anglican Church. So one of the separatist movements was called the Brownists, and in 1580, an impatient reformer called Robert Brown had established his separatist congregation in Norwich. and in his book A Treatise of Reformation Without Tarrying for Any, Brown argued that the Church of England was corrupted by the Catholic traces within it, and that the true Christians should leave it in favour of separatist movements. This meant that Brownists rejected the established form of the Church as unscriptural. As a result, they were persecuted for their actions, and many fled to Holland. That included Robert Brown. Those who were caught in England were either imprisoned or hanged. So this included John Copping and Elias Thacker, who were hanged in 1583 for distributing Brownist pamphlets. There was also the Mark Prelate tracts in 1588 to 1589, and they appeared in the late 1580s under the scurrilous, which means that they were spreading scandalous claims to ruin someone's reputation, Martin Mark Prelate tracts. So the pamphlets were anonymous and were written in London, and they addressed the ecclesiastical hierarchy, intolerable withstanders of the Reformation and enemies of the gospel. Many Puritans, like Thomas Cartwright, were horrified by the tracts and quickly disassociated themselves with them. However, it did give the Privy Council a good moment to bring about the final destruction of organised Puritanism. So in the spring of 1589, members of the High Commission issued an injunction that no London parish should allow the preaching of the stricter sort. So Thomas Cartwright was imprisoned, and he came before the Star Chamber. In 1593, Parliament was persuaded to pass an act against seditious sectaries, and this allowed authorities to execute those suspected of being a separatist. This meant that the emergence of the Mark Prelate tracts and separatism provided the ammunition for the government to launch their attack on Puritanism. So the Puritan influence had declined in the late 1580s, and this was partly because of the deaths of Leicester, Mildmay and Walsingham, and the disappearance of Presbyterianism, and that was after the death of John Field in 1589, and their damaged reputation after the Mark Prelate tracts, meant that the Puritan influences became more acceptable within the church. So the Lambeth Articles of 1595 also proved acceptable to both Puritans and opponents like Whitgift. So these were a series of 9 points of doctrine which reaffirmed the Calvinist doctrine of the Church. But the 1559 Book of Common Prayer was also accepted by both sides as an acceptable form of worship. So this meant that by the end of Elizabeth's reign, Puritans were housed within the Church. They did, however, hope to bring reform from the inside. So there was, however, always this threat of Catholicism, and Elizabeth aimed to keep the Church an acceptable alternative for everybody except the most dedicated papists. So this meant that whilst recusancy laws were passed to ensure attendance at church, little was done to limit private worship. This meant that Elizabeth only moved cautiously against Catholics. So for example, fines were imposed for the recusants, and those were those who didn't attend church services, and there were fines or confiscation of land for those who tried to persuade a priest to say the Catholic Mass, and any priest saying Catholic Mass could be imprisoned. Further energy was spent upon ridding lots of the Catholic imagery from the church, and old religious mystery plays were abolished because of their links to the feast of Corpus Christi. So most of the English Catholics survived as church papists. So this meant that they outwardly obeyed the law by attending Anglican church services despite their real beliefs. But there were a minority of people who followed the Catholic bishops, where only one of the Catholic bishops had conformed to the oath of supremacy in 1559. But the majority of others, though, which included parish priests, were more willing to accept it. Those that refused to conform often went into exile, and this was often to the Spanish Netherlands, where some priests survived as private chaplains to the nobility, where they performed private Catholic services. In some areas there were significant levels of Catholicism, like in Lancashire, but most clergy also continued to use traces of Catholicism in their worship, such as using Latin instead of English. But a Parliament of 1563 passed strict laws against office holders who refused to conform, and any priest saying Mass could be sentenced to death. However, these laws were not fully implemented, and it was only in 1577 when the first priest was executed for saying Mass. But there was many changing attitudes towards Catholicism between 1567 and 1572 due to the changing events. So in 1567, the Pope instructed English Catholics not to attend Anglican church services, and in the same year, the Spanish Duke of Alba was sent to the Netherlands to put down the rebellion that had broken out against the Spanish Catholic rule. So the presence of 10,000 Spanish troops across the Channel from southern England raised concerns that the Spanish were about to launch a Catholic offensive against the English. In 1568, Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived in England seeking sanctuary, and she represented a Catholic contender for the throne and somebody who the dissatisfied could gather around. Then in the same year, a seminary for priests was founded by William Allen in the Netherlands, and this trained missionaries to go to England in the spoils of Catholicism, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. In 1569, the Northern Rebellion took place. This was a rebellion with a Catholic nature, which we looked at last video, led by many members of the nobility. Then in 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth, and he did this to encourage rebellion against the Queen and to provide a justification for Catholic Europe to wage war on England. Then in 1571, the Ridolfi plot was uncovered, and this planned to murder Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. And then in 1572, Catholics in France slaughtered Protestants during St. Bartholomew's Massacre, and Cardinal Orsini had told the French king that not one Huguenot should be left alive in France, and this meant that thousands were murdered in Paris. So in Rome, bells rang in celebration, yet in England, Elizabeth feared that the massacre was only a prelude to a general attack upon herself and other Protestant states. So many of the bishops requested that any Catholic priests in prison should be sentenced to death, and the Bishop of London requested that Mary, Queen of Scots, should also be sentenced to death. So despite the growing list of problems, Elizabeth didn't want to further antagonize the Catholics and create outright confrontation. Even so, she did introduce certain measures. So in 1571, an act meant that the denial of Elizabeth's supremacy was made treasonable, and the publication of papal bulls was also made treasonable. However, she did block attempts from MPs in making penalties for recusancy or attendance at Mass more severe. However, it was made stricter in the 1581 Act to retain the Queen's Majesty's subjects in their due obedience, and this act meant that it became treason to withdraw allegiance to either the Queen or the Church of England. Saying Mass also became punishable by a heavy fine and imprisonment, and the fine for non-attendance at church was raised to £20 a month. Now, although the laity were not too harshly treated, 4 Catholic priests were executed in 1581 and 11 were executed in 1582. In 1587, the law was tightened, and recusants who defaulted on his payment of fine could have 2/3 of his estate seized by the Exchequer. The 1585 Act against Jesuits and seminary priests made it treasonable for priests under the Pope's authority to enter England, and this meant that 123 priests were convicted and executed under the terms of the Act from 1586 to 1603. So finally, we just need to look at the arrival of missionary priests, and that firstly starts with William Allen and his Douai College. So in 1568, a college was founded at Douai in this Spanish Netherlands, in order to train Catholic priests to send to England and keep Catholicism alive. This was founded by William Allen, who was an Englishman. So at the beginning of 1574, the first 3 priests secretly sailed to England to begin their work among the faithful. By 1575, 11 of these seminary priests had arrived in England, and in 1580 there were around 100. 179 arrived in England between 1580 and 1585. But these seminary priests had not come over to England as missionary priests. Instead of converting Protestants, they aimed to sustain the adherents of the old faith. However, they were a potent source of unrest within the country because they opposed the claims of what they believed to be an unlawful monarch. So this meant that they had to act secretly in England and hide with Catholic families. By 1585, even being a Catholic priest could warrant the death sentence as well. Then there was the Society of Jesus, which was founded in 1534, and they were a religious order who aimed at serving the Pope. And because of their desire to proselytize the nation, they became known as the Black Horsemen of the Pope. So they began sending Jesuit priests to England in 1580 with the intention of restoring Catholicism within England. So they were known for being more determined than the Catholic priests who had arrived in the country 6 years earlier. So Edmund Campion and Robert Parsons, together with 7 other colleagues, were the first to return. Edmund Campion in particular had had a very good education, and he had studied at St John's College, Oxford, and he was chosen to welcome the Queen upon her visit in 1569. He had also gained patronage from both Leicester and Lord Burleigh, and he was scouted as a possible future archbishop. However, he had suffered what he called remorse of conscience and detestation of the mind, which meant that he returned to the old faith, where he fled to Douai and reconciled to the Catholic communion. This did mean that he had a network of friends within Westminster, however. However, he was captured and executed in 1581, and the success of the Jesuit mission was also limited because Catholicism had become more of a country house religion rather than the popular faith that it had been in the 1560s. The cause of the missionaries was also weakened because of the disputes between the Douai priests and the Jesuit priests. This was because the Jesuits backed Spanish plans to invade England, whilst the Douai priests urged caution because they knew that Philip II was not just fighting England in the name of Catholicism, and he had his own personal agendas as well. So that is the religious development of Elizabeth I's reign. Hopefully you've enjoyed, and see you soon. Bye.